different aspects of the family business. You're looking at the aspect of the family business. One is being an employee, which is the Pedro case, and two, you're looking at it as being a shareholder. Now, you can always fire somebody, whether or not you ultimately have to give them back their job or pay them damages for wrongful termination. That's a different story. But trying to force someone to get out of the company and sell their shares, that's a different story. Hard to force someone to sell their shares to the company simply because you think they're not acting appropriately as an employee. You can take away their salary, but you can't take away their rights as a shareholder.
Welcome to Divided Dynasties. It's the family business podcast from Briol and Benson. I'm Pat Milan with Mark Briol and Scott Benson, two of the nation's leading attorneys in the area of complex commercial and financial cases. Now, on this podcast, we focus on family business and what makes it different from standard corporate or LLC entities. And hopefully we can help you navigate the intricacies of your family business. Mark and Scott have litigated every family dispute under the sun. I literally have not been able to find something you guys haven't touched. And I think misery loves company sometimes, which is why we have a bit of a treat today. I wanted to show a clip. We can't show the clip because of copyright protection. But there was a celebrity family-owned business that popped up on my radar. And I think it just proves when we took a look at it that it doesn't matter if you're rich or famous. Trying to operate a family business leads to conflict. And in this case, the piece that I saw, and by the way, we will put a link in here for people watching the podcast if you want to watch it, the clip itself. It's between one of America's most, I would call it, infamous families, the Kardashians. And on an episode of their TV show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which, by the way, I've never watched an entire episode, but I have seen clips. It really becomes apparent that the oldest Kardashian sister, Kourtney, really values her personal time a lot more than Kim, who is really focused on expanding the family business empire. So, I mean, it's clear when you look at the clip, guys. We looked at it before we started the podcast. They're not carrying an equal load. And part of what I wanted to poke at there, even though it's the Kardashians and we laugh about it, from your experience, I'm just wondering how many different ways have you seen these things blow up when different people are carrying a different part of the load?
Well, first of all, with respect to the Kardashians, I am a Kardashian fan. And I after looking at that clip, you have to remember that somebody videotaped it and then somebody made a decision that should be aired. And so I don't think that there's much that goes on in that family that's not scripted and completely played out and edited before it goes on camera. So whether one has more of a passion about the business or not, they both look very passionate to me about what was going on. It's one of those things where there are fights, especially in family businesses. One, because you grew up together, or you were brothers and sisters and had your father, and so you kind of know all of the soft spots that you can poke to create the greatest. I mean, it's like being in a marriage. I mean, you know what makes the other person mad, and that's what you go for. I mean, you want to get the anger out and get under their skin. With the folks like the Kardashians, I mean, the more money people have, the more they can fight. The better warriors they can have on their side of the table, the more money they can spend. I mean, and it's like I live out on Lake Minnetonka, and sometimes I'll see a $500,000 boat go by, and I'll ask my kids, why do you think they have a $500,000 boat on Lake Minnetonka? And my kids always answer, because they can. And so I think it plays out in different ways with different warriors and different amounts of money, but suffice it to say that it's the ability to finance the lawsuits that brings out the worst.
But Scott, don't you think sometimes the Kim Kardashians of the world, right? The ones who in their heart, they think they've got a lot more passion for the business than another family member, particularly like a sibling. They kind of have enough with it and they start thinking, I should limit their ownership. And you see it where they do things behind the scenes And the rationale is I'm working harder. I care about this more. It happens.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, it happens all the time. And you would think people would think about this when they're setting up their business to decide, hey, which one of us is going to be doing the majority of the work? Maybe that person deserves more of an interest in the company. But people don't think about that because it's like when you get married, I guess, and don't have a prenup, you think everything is going to go great. And you don't think about the fact that we all have different talents and expertise. Maybe one doesn't really want to spend the time in the business and should be limited more as to how much of an interest they're going to have in the company. The interesting things with the Kardashians is they probably have everything on tape. So in Minnesota, I won't talk about what California has. Minnesota basically says your reasonable expectations are going to control. And so their reasonable expectations are probably somewhere in their taping of what happened in their lives when they were setting up the company. So they may actually be able to go back and see, hey, Courtney said I can't work as hard as you do, but I deserve to have equal ownership because you're using my likeness and my name, and maybe that's recorded somewhere, and that would be important for us mere mortals. Write it down what your expectations are when you're coming in so that it's clear what people thought they were doing when they got entered into the business.
Hey, Mark, I want you to pretend for a minute that you're Kim's attorney, okay? And she shows up at the office and says, "Hey, I want to lower Kourtney Kardashian's ownership mix." What would you tell her?
Well, first of all, let's try and make it more realistic. I doubt very much whether she would come to my office. I think I would be the one doing the traveling if that was required. The lowering somebody's forcing a buyout of someone's shares is almost more difficult than forcing a purchase of your shares by the company. I mean, trying to lower somebody's share ownership because you think they're not doing a substantial job or something, very difficult to do. About the only reason that you can force another person to sell their shares to the company versus another person being able to have the company buy their shares is if you show that they're actually involved in some intentional misconduct, like stealing, embezzlement, fraud on the company, or doing something to damage the company severely. Otherwise, you're stuck with that shareholder, and getting that shareholder out, I think, is more difficult than that shareholder trying to do a buyout on their own.
There are, I think, a lot of real life similarities, even though they are the Kardashians. I mean, let's assume someone in Courtney's position, right? More devoted to family time than like work time. And you assume, hey, we got in this together. I've got a job for life. Does someone like that have a case if they're repeatedly walking out or difficult to schedule for work projects? And they say, well, it's because I'm more devoted to my family. Do they have a case if they have a job for life?
Well, you might in Minnesota because there is the Pedro decision, which we've talked about in earlier episodes, that basically say if your reasonable expectation is that you have a lifetime employment, you that is what you have. You are owed lifetime employment. It'd be interesting to see in this case how they'd prove that she had that reasonable expectation. In the Pedro case that we talked about before, of course, they had worked at the company for 40 some years together. And then when the brother who they were trying to force out and who they fired started asking some questions about the accounting, they tried to get rid of him. Now, that's probably not the case here with the Kardashians and Courtney, who really may have had the expectation, hey, I don't have the same burning interest in this business, but we entered into this in an equal partnership and you agreed to do that because you were going to use my likeness and use my name and you were going to trade on that. And that's what I bring to the party. So it really depends on what the facts were there.
Hey, Mark, what would your advice be to someone who's like Courtney, and in their family business, they're being kind of domineered by another family member? What would you say to them to protect their interest long term?
Well, first of all, I want to go back to the question that you were asking,
Yeah.
Scott. And the thing that you have to remember is you're looking at two different aspects of the family business. You're looking at the aspect of the family business. One is being an employee, which is the Pedro case, and two, you're looking at it as being a shareholder.
Mm.
Now, you can always fire somebody, whether or not you ultimately have to give them back their job or pay them damages for wrongful termination. That's a different story. But trying to force someone to get out of the company and sell their shares, that's a different story. Hard to force someone to sell their shares to the company simply because you think they're not acting appropriately as an employee. You can take away their salary, but you can't take away their rights as a shareholder. Now, going back to your question, which was
So if you've got the person who feels like they're always being minimized, but they have family on their side, what should they be doing to protect their interests long term?
well, it's one of those things is to establish a record. Now, we tried a case not too long ago where I would not endorse that people do this, but one of the board members was thinking that he should start protecting himself. So he taped 35 hours of material of all the board meetings and all the conversations he was having, including conversations that he would have with staff members about various members of the board of directors. What you can do is start protecting yourself, or consult a lawyer, make your issues known, and try and reach an accommodation. I mean, if you can't and you ultimately do not want to be employed by the company, you can either quit. If you ultimately do not want to have any ownership in the company and want to be bought out, well, then you're going to have to make a buyout offer. You're going to have to tell them, this is what I want for my stock. In that case, you're going to have to get a lawyer. You're going to have to get an expert witness. You're going to have to look at the books and records, and you're going to have to make a determination as to what you think the value of the company is and how much you should be entitled to, which in the end is an equitable case for the judge to figure out in terms of what someone is owed and when they should be paid out.
As we were looking at the Kardashians, you think about, where do these things head? There's another famous family fight that you guys know about that ended up in the courts. It was it wasn't television in Hollywood. It was dairy cattle and a dairy cattle operation. But like the Kardashians, I mean, they had different siblings with different talents and different roles. In the case of this other business, you had a brother who was acting as a CEO, and the other one was essentially working on the factory floor. This gets to that. I think what we're really talking about here is this balance of power. Then there's also the balance of ownership. Isn't that where this attitudes and thoughts about who controls what, and if I'm getting, isn't that where it all really comes from in one way or the other?
It is in the cattle case. It they were all equal shareholders, and they were all entitled equally to a distribution of the assets of the company if it were sold. What was troubling is that one of the brothers, had taken over as the CEO, and he was paying himself exorbitant amounts of money, and the other person was getting paid a reasonable salary, but not as much as the CEO. And that's what created the dispute. I mean, it was the feeling that one of them was being treated unfairly by the person who controlled the ability to pay him more and didn't.
Well, and I think the issue is, the brother who was not the CEO was being paid reasonably for a person of his position. He essentially was out milking the cows and actually working in the company, in the business, on the ground level. And a person of that level, he was probably getting paid what that person would get paid. The other brother was taking a huge salary and then claiming they couldn't pay any dividends out to the shareholders. And that's where the issue came in. Is there was a huge disparity in salaries. One was claiming, well, this is what CEOs in a comparable size business make. The other was saying, yeah, but because you're taking in so much of the money that the company generates, in salary, in benefits, in flying you around on vacations that you claim are company related, et cetera, because you're taking so much of that money, you're not paying me the dividends I deserve, and so this is unfair to me.
So
Uh,
in a
If I,
situation
re-
like,
if
how
I
did that
remember
one end?
correctly, if I remember correctly, didn't there come a time when they refused, usually in companies at the end of the year, they issue dividends sufficient to be able to pay the taxes
Mhm.
that are required to be paid in terms of whatever distributions they took during the year. And I think in this case, the older brother who was the one manipulating the payments of funds to the other shareholders refuse to make distributions to pay taxes. And I mean, obviously, all of a sudden you're looking at a huge tax bill at the end of the year with an expectation that there's going to be a distribution, at least in the amount sufficient to allow you to pay your taxes. I think that was one of the real triggering events in this case that set everybody off.
So I'm guessing that the brother who was working on the floor milking cows prevailed in this case.
he prevailed in getting his value for his shares out of the company, um, and, uh, and at a value that our expert basically said the company should be valued at. The interesting thing is, I think he would have probably stayed with the company and wanted to keep working at it and continuing to see it grow had this not all happened. And as Mark said, one of the favorite things of those who are kind of in control of the company, who want to basically oppress and force out the other shareholder, one of the things that they will do is stop paying distributions to pay taxes, maybe stop paying for health insurance, kind of cut off those things that they can afford to pay for because they're making millions of dollars. But the person who's getting paid $50,000 a year can't possibly pay for those, to pay their taxes, uh, and can't possibly pay on their own their health insurance, et cetera.
So there's somebody watching this right now who's like, you just described my situation, right? I've got
Oh,
a
I'm sure.
sibling or a family member who's paying themselves a lot. I can't even pay the taxes on the stuff. Uh, I mean, if they're in that position, is this call Briol and Benson time, or should they be doing something internally first?
No, I think if you're actually at that stage, I mean, you're at the stage of defaulting on your taxes. I mean, not being able to make a tax bill. I mean, things have become pretty urgent by that time. And obviously, the person who has made the decision not to distribute money for taxes knows what he or she is doing and is trying to force the other person into a lawsuit situation. So there's no I mean if that happens, there's no time to try and do it on your own. I mean,
Yeah.
because it's too complicated. They've probably been withholding books and records from you. They've probably been withholding information about the company necessary for you to be able to file your taxes. I mean, they're setting you up, and it's time to get professional assistance.
So there's two sides to this coin, obviously. There's the person in charge. Maybe someone's watching this and they're doing it. Your advice to them to get their act together to avoid what would become a really ugly fight.
Well, it would be to hire us. I mean, we do represent both sides of the minority situation, and, and so if they want to know the right way to be able to get people out of the company, or to be able to lower distributions without being sued and doing it the right way so that they automatically don't start a lawsuit. Well, again, you need professional advice on this. In the cattle case, we knew they had professional advice. And as I said, when you have money, you can hire better armies, better weapons, better ammunition. I mean, and so you're usually pretty stocked up by the time you're ready to get out on the battle floor.
Scott, we've talked about this in other podcasts, but it is pretty astounding when you look at family businesses, how little documentation actually exists that should and needs to exist. I mean, if you're the party who feels like you've been wronged, and if it's a family-owned business, you're going to cause pure hell for the rest of the family because they probably haven't done what they need to do because it's just what happens in family businesses.
That's true. One of the best things, though, that I think we've talked about this before, one of the best things you can incorporate is a buyout provision. So if you want to be bought out, here's the price. It does require some diligence. Usually they would need a yearly appraisal of what the company is valued at to determine what the price is going to be. But believe me, if it push comes to shove, it's well worth having that complied with on a yearly basis to make sure that there's just no question. Look, if you want out, here's what you're getting. We aren't going to have to hire experts. We aren't going to have to go to court. We have this in our either bylaws or any of the corporate agreements that you might have. If it's a LLC in the management agreement, we've got this in writing, and we followed all the formalities. We know what, if you want to get bought out, here's what you're going to get.
Yeah. Well,
The,
I
the,
think we'll wrap it up here. Oh, go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
the interesting thing about that is, first of all, you'll see that there are a lot of bylaws that require there to be a valuation at the end of each year, and they don't invariably they don't do it at the end of each year. Or if they do a valuation at the end of each year, it's usually by some person who is hired by the person in control of the company, and he understands what the purpose of doing this valuation is for. And so they can, expert witnesses, valuations are very subjective in a lot of cases. They can move the needle down, meaning the company is less valuable. And so when it actually happens, they look back and say, oh my God, this company just isn't that valuable. I'll buy you out at these regular valuations that we had done. And then, of course, you get a lawyer involved and you find out that these are basically false valuations that have occurred. And then you get into another fight about whether or not those were true valuations or not.
Yeah, and hopefully your fight's not as ugly as the Kardashians fight, which, by the way, we have the link to it if anybody wants to see it. I think our viewers can tell you guys are really good at helping minority shareholders get a family business on track and performing in the best interest of all the shareholders. Whether it is a minority shareholder rights, securities fraud, patent litigation, or a high asset divorce, Briol and Benson are prepared to answer your questions and help you figure out if you have a case and how to get control of your rights. For more information, go to briollaw.com. And if you have questions about your family business or any other complex commercial cases, you can send them to us by email, podcast@briollaw.com. And to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or YouTube. Mark, Scott, thanks for your time today, and we'll see you guys on our next podcast.
Thank you.